Let's turn that magnifying glass or the binoculars around to get a bird's eye view of history and talk to Vera Shirav. Vera, I know you've been listening, and we've spoken about this. It's very hard to say anything to this, but you have a different perspective because you know where it all comes from, not just from reading history books, but from having experienced it in real life.
Yes, but I'll tell you, it's extremely upsetting to hear the details of the cabal in Israel. I mean, it really is, because essentially Israel has lost its raison d'etre. The government is doing what Mengele didn't finish. I mean, this is what's going on. It's unbelievable. And people all over the world are gasping. Why Israel? Why Israel? Well, my explanation is that, damn it, Israelis, Jews, no different from others. And so when you have corrupt government, you're going to have all the corrupt elements showing up. It doesn't matter that it's Israel. The other thing is that, yes, I keep talking about history, well, because, of course, I was in that history, but this is really, it shouldn't be that only a witness takes history seriously. History is really how you can discern patterns, similarities. And one of the things that people come really in, I'm being besieged, I can tell you, for interviews and things. I mean, really, it's too much. But part of it is because nobody else who touches it to make the comparison is left standing. I mean, there's a businessman who has 3 breweries in Brooklyn, and he put on whatever, Twitter or something, made a comparison. And my God, they're ready to lynch him. He may lose his business. Well, he's going to be okay. I met with him, but the point is, his whole family were either victims or survivors. Doesn't matter. So this tells me, of course, that is kind of a real, how should I say, that's the hot spot. They are terrified of people starting to see the parallels between the prelude and what's happening now. Otherwise there wouldn't be this intensity from all kinds of both individuals and institutions. But that's not what I'm going to talk to you about today. Today, I'm going to talk about something else. But first, I want to just bring out that, Albert Camus, the French philosopher, he said, the only means to fight the plague is honesty. Well, guess what? As we know, honesty is nowhere to be found within the corporate-dominated government and public health agencies. So for 2 years, we've all been subjected to the psychological weapons that the Nazis used to maintain a state of anxiety. I'm not so sure about, the marching exactly and who it is, because one of the things that Avital mentioned, which is very true, is that the people who are most unthinking, really, or shielding themselves, as ignorant, are the educated. This is very apparent, I think, all over, which ought to give us a signal that the system of education is a huge failure in terms of what we thought education should be. Because the more years you spent at an educational institution, particularly universities, somehow the less you are willing to trust your own thinking, your own critical thinking, and instead are looking for authority to tell you what you should do next. That's a very big condemnation of, the educational process. What I am looking for now, what I want to talk about is, look, I mean, we've been deluged with fear-mongering propaganda now for the 2 years. And the horrific scenes of police in black uniforms brutally attacking demonstrators in European cities, in Ottawa, in Australia, and in Israel. These scenes are absolute painful reminders of the Holocaust. The objective under the Nazis and now is actually exactly the same. It is to gain control over people's lives by conditioning them to obey government directives, no matter what. Now, I want to address the pivotal role that eugenics as a hierarchical authoritarian ideology is, and it leads to genocide. That's its end game. Eugenics was crafted and appeals to the elite segments of society. But it also appeals to the corporate oligarchs and selected government officials. And that's more important. The British eugenicists provided the theoretical foundation, which has then been used to justify social and economic inequality, to legitimize discrimination and apartheid, as well as violence against dissenters. But it was the American robber barons who provided the financial, the practical means that set in motion public policies and population control legislation. If someone can show picture 1, which is the cover of Edwin Black's book, War Against the Weak. And he puts it this way, he says, eugenics was conceived at the outset of the 20th century and implemented by America's wealthiest, most powerful, and most learned men against the nation's most vulnerable and helpless. And that's exactly right. The American titans of industry used their influence to enact laws and discriminatory public policies that swept aside moral principles and stripped segments of the population of their civil rights and their human rights. In 1915, a joint eugenics venture was brokered by John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, and Mrs. E.H. Harriman, mother of the future statesman Averell Harriman. They had already consolidated their monopolies in oil, railway, steel, and the banking industries. So at this point, they sought to preserve their vast wealth and advance their interest by investing in methods to control and reduce populations. The goal of eugenics was and is to eliminate people whom the elite deemed inferior genetic material. They funded a massive lobbying campaign for the enactment of laws to sterilize those whom they deemed unfit. Sterilization laws were first enacted in 28 states in the United States. Their objective was to sterilize 10% of the American population, that was 15 million Americans. This was to be accomplished under the guise of improving public health and the human race. Number 2, U.S. sterilization laws served, as you know, the model for the Nazi racial hygiene laws. For over a century, the Rockefellers have continued to be the largest financial backers and drivers of eugenics and the depopulation agenda. Number 3. The ninth.
Pictures.
Either it work. It's all right. If it doesn't work, we'll, I'm used to technology and.
We have 6 pictures, Vera.
I know, whatever. Okay.
Let's start with the first one, then the second one, then the third one.
Okay, the third one should be the 1918 Spanish influenza.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now.
There it is.
Okay. So this is what mostly I want to talk about, the 1918 Spanish influenza. It's estimated that it killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. This catastrophic pandemic has been encased in a false narrative for over a century. An examination of the facts reveals a plethora of similarities between that false narrative of the pandemic in 1918 and the 2020 coronavirus pandemic. The 1918 pandemic did not emanate from Spain. It was not a flu, nor was it caused by a virus. By misidentifying it as influenza from Spain helped to conceal the true nature and origin. In 1918, as the United States entered World War I, the military was expanded to 6 million men, of whom 2 million were sent to the battlefields of Europe. Scientists at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now the Rockefeller University, seized the opportunity to test an experimental vaccine on this now new available pool of human guinea pigs. Few people realize that disease killed far more soldiers on all sides than machine guns and mustard gas or anything else associated with World War I. In January 1918, an experimental meningitis vaccine made from the pus of horses was tested on soldiers. Dr. Frederick Gates, board president of the Rockefeller Institute and trustee of Rockefeller Foundation, began the experiment at Fort Riley, Kansas in January 1918. In his 1918 published report, he notes that the vaccine was given in 3 random spitball doses. Not exactly accurate. 4,792 men received the first dose. 4,257 got the second dose. And only 3,702 received all 3 doses. That's a reduction of close to 23%. Dr. Gates doesn't report what happened to 1,090 men who did not show up for the 3rd dose. Gates wrote that shortly after being injected, soldiers exhibited flu-like symptoms, including cough, vomiting, and diarrhea. The reactions, he said, simulated the onset of epidemic meningitis. But Dr. Gates brushed it aside and declared it was not actual meningitis. One wonders what science Dr. Gates relied on. Influenza outbreaks were reported at 14 of the biggest armed force training camps. Recovered troops carried and transmitted the infection to healthy soldiers in the battlefields of Europe. A 2008 report surveyed worldwide fatality and mortality rates during the pandemic. They described how bacteria rapidly spread from infected people to others, particularly in crowded settings, such as hospital wards, military camp barracks, troop ships, and mines. Now, further evidence was obtained from something like 9,000 autopsies worldwide. The autopsies proved that the 1918 flu was not a flu. According to the autopsy lung cultures, bacterial pneumonia killed at least 92.7%. When World War I ended on November 11th, 1918, soldiers returned to their home, spreading the killer bacterial pneumonia worldwide. One of the most important eyewitnesses was Dr. Eleanor McBean. She witnessed the human carnage at the age of 13. She and her African-American family did not get vaccinated. They remained healthy throughout the pandemic. She became a doctor and authored several books, including The Poisoned Needle, 1957, Vaccination, the Silent Killer, 1977, and Swine Flu Expose, 1977. She provided very vivid descriptions. I'll read a little bit. When the flu was at its peak, all the stores were closed, as well as the schools, businesses, even the hospital, as the doctors and nurses had been vaccinated and were down with the flu. Number 5, no one was on the streets. It was like a ghost town. We seemed to be the only family which didn't get the flu. So my parents went from house to house, doing what they could to look after the sick, as it was impossible to get a doctor. If it were possible for germs, bacteria, virus, or bacilli to cause disease, they had plenty of opportunity to attack my parents when they were spending so many hours a day in the sick rooms. But they didn't get the flu, and they didn't bring home germs to attack us children. None of our family had the flu, not even a sniffle. And it was in the winter with deep snow on the ground. Dr. McBean identified the experimental bacterial meningitis vaccine as the primary culprit. She wrote that only those who were vaccinated perished. Sound familiar?
It does.
Can such a vaccine-generated catastrophe happen again?
No.
I think it needs to be really, this example is, I believe, extremely important,
Yes.
given the players. Okay, number 7. In 2018, PBS, that's public broadcasting, aired a documentary, The First Wave. The documentary fills in some of the gaps that Dr. Gates failed to disclose. We learned that by March 11th, the Fort Riley camp surgeon was confronted with the first wave of the pandemic. 100 men a day were entering the infirmary with the same malady. Some 2 million US soldiers were injected with the Rockefeller experimental vaccine. It sickened them and weakened their immune system before they were shipped to Europe. Number 8 is a hospital. You've seen these, I'm sure. Now, when the war ended, the Rockefeller Institute sent the deadly meningitis concoction for use in civilians in England, France, Belgium, Italy, and other Western European countries, thereby spreading the epidemic worldwide. I assume that he didn't send it to Germany because that's who they were all fighting. So maybe Germany was spared the Spanish flu. But what I want to ask, and I think that needs to be asked, is was the decision to ship the deadly vaccine abroad once they already knew what it was doing? Was it just for profit über alles, or was it part of a eugenics genocide playbook? Now, Anthony Fauci continues to cite the 1918 pandemic to generate public fear and panic of viruses. He resorts to frightening people into getting vaccinated. So in 2007, Fauci was on a fear-mongering campaign about the H5N1 avian influenza viruses. And he warned, I quote, heightened international alarm that an influenza pandemic may be imminent. Concern has been raised that the new pandemic, as fatal as the pandemic of 1918 or more so, could be developing. The same year, he authored an article claiming that the genetic sequencing of the entire genome of the 1918 virus has been accomplished. Dr. Fauci lied. There was no virus genome to be sequenced. In 2020, in December 2020, Fauci again raised the specter of the 1918 Spanish flu. And I read, coronavirus is a pandemic of historic proportions that has the potential to be as serious as the 1918 Spanish flu, in which 50 million people probably died. I think we can't deny that fact. So my question is, if a vaccine has likely killed 50 to 100 million people, the loss of those lives far outweighs any vaccination benefit. Now, the goal of today's globalists and their planned Great Reset remains the same as it was in the 1930s. Their objective is world domination and total control of the world's natural resources, financial resources, and human resources. The global oligarchs seek to overthrow democracies and to replace them with the corporatist global model. This time, their most effective weapon is today's high-tech surveillance capabilities. The author and historian Anton Chaikin points out that, and I quote, IG Farben was not only responsible for Hitler's rise to power in concert with the Rockefeller family, they became part of the elite's plan to take over the world. The current corporate takeover is the culmination of that plan and is a continuation of the eugenics program begun in the 1920s. The goal remains the same: world domination by the elites and the culling of the herd. After World War II, the global pharmaceutical colossus was a reincarnation of the IG Farben cartel pattern, which is profit before safety and the use of drugs and vaccines as a means of control. The Rockefellers continue to be the most instrumental global in the globalist plan for world domination. It's a century that they have been at the forefront. They have controlled medicine since the early 20th century. They essentially created the modern pharmaceutical empire to dispose of petrochemical waste products left over from their refining process. In the 1920s and 1930s, they financed eugenics research at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany. And the foundation remains one of the most influential institutions financing radical genocidal eugenics globally, including vaccines that are meant to end fertility. Their strategy is to impose global medical tyranny managed by big pharma and big tech. Now, a COVID-19 pandemic was first outlined by the Rockefeller Foundation publication in 2010. The chapter Lockstep laid out the scenario of the global pandemic quite perfectly, concluding that the only way to mitigate the global pandemic was to follow the Chinese authoritarian police state. Lockdowns was the recommended method. Now, the Rockefeller lockdown recommendation unimaginably was actually implemented by governments across all of Western Europe, United States, Canada, and Australia. That was, I think, a big shock to all of us that people actually did it and complied. In April 2020, the foundation issued a blueprint for the creation of a nationwide DNA database for the entire United States population. Bill Gates, a lifelong eugenicist and a major shareholder in the business of vaccines, declared that a COVID vaccine will be the final solution. Now, you can imagine as a survivor, I take that very seriously. One of the things that we can learn from all of this is that really they have put out in documents that anyone can read what their plans are. And most will say, oh, that's conspiracy theory. No, it's not. They're laying out and they're going according to plan. We're living at a very critical juncture in human history. We are on the brink of a totalitarian dictatorship, and this time it's global. This time there will be no rescuers. It's for us. If we don't reverse the trajectory of obediently following government dictates, we will either be annihilated or revert to the status of slaves. You can ask me anything you want, but I thought I'd throw the 1918 because I don't know that you've heard of it before as far as there are so many similarities, really. I didn't have time to, I'm sure you've heard from scientists and doctors the various hazards of the vaccines, that I didn't have to do that. But this is now much more in plain sight, as I say. And I think somehow or other we have to get it across. I think that one of the things that was said previously is, absolutely true. We see it with the truckers in Canada. We see it with people, working class people have not been bamboozled. Mm-hmm. They recognize, that they're trying to bamboozle them. And so they're not buying it. And even if they have to wear masks to maintain their jobs, they wink and whatever and say, this is all nonsense. The problem really is the educated class, the ones that are bombarded by the upper echelon media, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and all that. That is the worst, because they really, really trust those publications. I think that we are making headway. I think that people, there will be a big demonstration tomorrow in Vienna. I don't know what it will take. I just hope that there won't be again the sights that we saw, for example, in Ottawa, where a woman was trampled by a policeman's horse. But violence is really just beneath the surface. And I'm not sure I would really want to hear what is the best way to avert the violence from exploding.
I think that's what you're doing, Vera, exposing this, and what we're all trying to do. I think we have to follow suit. We, all of us, have to expose these things and have to make it clear that it's all out there in the open. Anyone can read it.
Yeah.
Anyone can read it, and it's a matter of time, I suppose, until this whole house of cards implodes. Unfortunately, however, many people will fall victim to this one way or another, and there's nothing we can do about it. I think that is the only way out. Exposing them, trying to get as many as possible from that 40% group who are sitting on the fence to come over to our side, not to save ourselves. We can save ourselves, but to save some of them.
The problem that that many of us, I think, have bumped into with friends, with family. I know a family in Israel, is to pull them over to read the other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Don't listen to me. No, the answer that I got from my sister-in-law was, I trust the Department of Health. End of story. Mm-hmm. You see, now I call this willful ignorance. And from what Avital was saying, I mean, they're kind of really shielding themselves from the inevitable, as Israel was the first to jump on the bandwagon, and they're now the first, doing the worst. But what will it take to get, because really, I don't know what it is that caused this kind of like a freezing. People freeze and no, I don't want to look at that. I don't want to. What do you mean you don't want to look? Why not look and talk and argue? That's okay. No. That tells you that there is beneath that shield of, I'm trusting, authority. There is this unease, I think, yes. Because why wouldn't you want to get information, whatever it is?
Because it'll destroy your whole. I think that's what people are afraid of. It'll destroy your whole view of the world as you have learned it over the last 70 or 80 years. This is what Michael Swinwood, one of the attorneys who we cooperate with from Canada, says. He says, I've been lied to for 73 years. That's how old he is. And I've spoken to one of the experts today. She's a biologist, and she understands everything, of course. And she has a sister who's a lawyer. She says, my sister understands everything as well, but that one step that she will not take, conspiracy, because that is just too much.
Yeah. I know they don't want to, but look, in the 30s, people didn't believe Hitler either.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. They didn't believe it. They just thought he was a ranting lunatic, the people outside of Germany. But that's just it. I mean, a lot of it is actually foretold.
Yeah.
But people don't believe it. Okay. The problem that they have, these psychopaths, is that they cannot control individuals such as us. Mm-hmm. And that's this. I'm sure that this is something they need to crack that nut, because they can control, we see how they can control groups, they can control whole countries, and they certainly can control heads of state, with nice thick checks. But they can't predict who the individuals, will be who will not go along. And then they don't know how to intimidate us to do it, to go along anyway. But this is part of, I feel, the whole eugenics model is based on really a hierarchical, division, and it's of course totally arbitrary. The ones deciding are the elites who don't want, don't like some, either an ethnic group or a racial group or whatever, a working class. and they decide to put them at the bottom of the heap. But individuals really, when biology is free to do its natural selection and all that, then you can't predict. They have been trying, and German psychiatry and American psychiatry have been trying for all these decades, since the 20s, to find a genetic cause for all kinds of social ailments, which they categorize as various psychological disorders. And they've never found them. That's all they're tinkering with is genetic, and it ain't there. But that's because they want to, in other words, find that which they want to find. They don't really do real science. By the way, it was Rockefeller who funded genetic psychiatry at the Institute. Yeah. They want that as, I guess, as a validation that eugenics is a science. Well, it's not.
Of course not.
I would like to make a shout out for Vera having mentioned Edwin Black. And I'd like to just elaborate for 30 seconds on that. His research and the books he has written over a period of years is possibly one of the most important collections of information that we've ever had on the role of technology in the Holocaust and everything that built up to what happened in Germany. And interestingly, the original Hollerith computer was designed and assembled in the basement at Columbia University in New York City. The basement at Hamilton Hall was given to temporary projects. They happened to like IBM, and they gave them half the basement in Hamilton Hall. And that's where they got all the brainiacs together and came up with the Hollerith computer that made its way straight into Nazi Germany ultimately, and took care of all of the statistics, statistical analysis, all of the train scheduling, and just you name it. IBM was there. His work was damning, still is. The books are all available anywhere you find books. But the other half of Hamilton Hall, just interestingly enough, was occupied by the technocracy group that happened to be at Columbia University in 1932. And they rubbed shoulders with these people.
Yeah.
And I'm sure one scientist speaks to another scientist and says, like Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. I have a vision for the future. Yeah. And here we are today talking about it, 90, 100 years later. It's absolutely incredible. Thank you, Vera, for your testimony. any of Edwin Black's books are worth reading for historical perspective.
That's right. Yep. He lays out the IBM in detail.
She does.
Thank you so much for your evidence, Mrs. Sharav. I've got a following question for you. Thank you that you've actually set time aside so that you can give evidence in this grand jury. Very much appreciated. You have mentioned in your evidence that the Nazis has used exactly the same state of anxiety. And is it possible that you can actually draw some specific similarities between what you have seen and experienced during the Holocaust and what is currently happening with this COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I was a little girl at the time. I was 3.5. What I experienced was the fear that was just palpable. Everybody all the time under a state of fear. And in the camp, the fear was to be put on a list, because the list was either that people were sent for slave labor or they were sent to the death camp. So this hung over, all the time. I was too young to have heard, the propaganda, the radio, and because at that time it was essentially radio. But I can tell you that certainly the Jewish population, wherever they were in total terror. But I think that they also had the German people in fear as well, because if you didn't follow exactly what you were supposed to, someone would report you, and people disappeared. There were, concentration camps in Germany, and some Germans wound up there if they said something that somebody told that they said, that sort of thing. Same thing went on in the Soviet Union. So, when you are under a totalitarian regime, you are always in a state of fear because they may change the rules all of a sudden. We had that in the lockdowns where the curfews were different. 1 week it was 9 o'clock, another week it was 10 o'clock, that sort of thing. All of that is very calibrated and calculated.
Absolutely.
To create anxiety and fear. Yeah. It's to destabilize your, ability to feel secure.
So, from what you've just mentioned now, it is clear for the jury that we are actually talking about fear. They're using exactly the same kind of methods during the Holocaust. And you've mentioned in your evidence that we're talking about the propaganda that the people actually heard from the news, radio more specifically. And then you've mentioned also something very interesting where you've mentioned a list. So the people were fearful. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I can see exactly the same kind of similarity when it comes in the evidence that we've heard today, that if you do not have a green pass in Israel, and that basically goes almost like for each and every other country that is following in lockstep, to me, that seems to be exactly the same. Will you agree with that, Mrs. Shirav?
Yes, I do. I think that, there's always the matter of degree and that sort of thing. But I think that what has been done now in the 21st century takes into account, they have perfected the psychological weapons all these years. So they don't have to really be brutal. They don't have to be physical, really. And we see it because imagine they really have been able to impose their will on the entire Western globe, at least the Western. This is because they've perfected the method, the psychology. Look, psychologists are the ones that conducted the torture at Guantanamo Bay and in Iraq. Okay, psychologists, that's really part of their business. And someone asked before, who are the ones who, who can we really blame? Who caused this? Psychologists and psychiatrists have a huge contribution, if you will, to this kind of evil, because it is manipulating emotions and thoughts and for ill, it's always it's like for a poison. They are trying to undermine our self-assurance, our self-image, and our trust in our own judgment.
Okay. So, having regarded you are a Holocaust survivor, what is the main thing that basically stands out for you when you look at the COVID-19 landscape? And also from the stories that you've actually heard from the people who survived, because obviously you can give us a first-hand narrative.
I I do remember quite a few things. And the first of all, immediately when we were chased out of our home, right, made to wear a yellow star is a sign of shame, and then deported and herded into a concentration camp and starved and all that. When I see now, they've in different countries, they've prepared camps, which they call quarantine camps, but they're concentration camps. The Nazis demonized Jews as spreaders of disease. It was also so spreaders of disease then, and now spreader of infection now. They're using really even verbatim. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned before, and in other venues, one of the things that I am trying to fight against is the attempt by, I call them vigilantes, who pounce on people if they even mention the possibility that there are some parallels and that we ought to, be aware of them and not go in that direction. Now, what they are doing is making the Holocaust irrelevant to history now. And that, I believe, is a far worse sin than Holocaust denial. Because they know what they're doing. They're protecting, it's as if they're protecting their fiefdom. They're putting it away in a safe deposit box, not allowed to touch the Holocaust when you're studying history. Why? I realize that the why is because if more people actually looked at it, they would recognize the similarities of the stages, the years before the gas chambers. Now, the fact that the gas chambers happened, as a Auschwitz survivor, Primo Levi, an Italian, had said, it happened, therefore it can happen again. It can happen everywhere. That's a lesson. That's an important lesson. We are still, human beings didn't really change. And human beings of all groups are capable of being, leaders and saints and devils. We really have to understand human nature has the capacity for both, for good and for evil, and we have to make choices. And when we are confronted by evil, we need to recognize it, and do something about it rather than close our eyes and not see. That's the worst thing.
Mr. Shirav, my last question to you, and seeing that you've actually drawn the parallels now, I would like to find out from you when this pandemic started to roll out, which we actually say it's a pandemic. When was the first time you've actually started to see the similarities and say, no, to me, it seems eerily similar to what I've experienced as a child and what the Jewish people has experienced. And it seems like this is exactly the same trajectory that, or the pathway that this COVID-19 is steering, not just now in Germany, but on a global scale. When did you start to actually see that similarities?
I think, well, first of all, I didn't, I looked into the idea of lockdowns and all that, and I saw that actually science said the exact opposite. Yeah. Never do that. Really, there's evidence. So I realized there's something really wrong. Then the other thing, the lockdowns, what they actually did, there were a couple of things that the lockdowns did. Yes, they made people, prisoners in their home, isolate them. Isolation is the worst thing. And of course, a lot of elderly really, really suffered. They died. But they also demolished local businesses. Well, that's the transfer of wealth. So everybody has to now use Zoom, technology, Amazon, only the big box stores and do everything digitally. At that time, there wasn't the digital and all that, but there certainly was house arrest and things like that where you couldn't go out and there were curfews. But once they really started to push the vaccine, and before it was even launched, before it was let out of the bag, because I think it must have been already in some warehouse before, because it was talked about so much, as Gates called it, the final solution. That, and of course, that it got linked right away to green passport. I mean, that's it. That was, yeah. That the parallel is definite. And, right now, I think it was France that took back passports of people who didn't have the third shot. Well, that's what Hitler did. I think it was 38 or 39 when he eliminated the passports of Jews, because that was the time that the gates were closed. Before 38, he actually encouraged Jews to leave. They just had to leave all their property. But many didn't go. Many did.
Thank you very much for your evidence, Mr. Shirav.
Thank you.
Well, Vera, I want to say I'm sure glad that someone like you is still sitting in the saddle, because that is really, really encouraging. So we're not all alone here, but we have someone at our side who keeps reminding us of what this all comes from. And I think if we don't see history, history will repeat itself. That's why it's so important to see the parallels. And I think, I'm wondering, would you agree with that? Those who chose and choose to ignore the parallels, aren't they the true Holocaust deniers?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. But especially those who pounce on people who do make the connection. This has been, this is a constant. I mean, Bobby Kennedy had that happen to him, and in fact, I began to really take on whatever interviews I'm asked after an interview with Bobby, in which I raised it into something, and he said, well, you can talk about that, but I can't. And I thought to myself, why not? I mean, talk clarifies. Talk is how we communicate. I mean, I don't believe in having subjects verboten. If somebody forbids me, then that's what I want to go and look up. Because, I finally realized that this is very important. They are doing that with the venom, and a lot of Jewish institutions are doing it, trying to prevent people from seeing the connection. Well, I'm doing that.
Mrs. Shirav,
Yes.
thank you so much. You remember me the Albert Einstein quote, if I were to remain silent,
Yes.
I will be guilty of complicity.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, look, that is what we have to remember. Not to be complicit by silence, because silence means, and our trust in our own judgment.
Okay. So, having regarded you are a Holocaust survivor, what is the main thing that basically stands out for you when you look at the COVID-19 landscape? And also from the stories that you've actually heard from the people who survived, because obviously you can give us a first-hand narrative.
I do remember quite a few things, and first of all, immediately when we were chased out of our home, right, made to wear a yellow star is a sign of shame, and then deported and herded into a concentration camp and starved and all that. When I see now, in different countries, they've prepared camps, which they call quarantine camps, but they're concentration camps. The Nazis demonized Jews as spreaders of disease. It was also so spreaders of disease then, and now spreader of infection now. They're using really even verbatim. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned before, and in other venues, one of the things that I am trying to fight against is the attempt by, I call them vigilantes, who pounce on people if they even mention the possibility that there are some parallels and that we ought to, be aware of them and not go in that direction. Now, what they are doing is making the Holocaust irrelevant to history now. And that, I believe, is a far worse sin than Holocaust denial. Because they know what they're doing. They're protecting, it's as if they're protecting their fiefdom. They're putting it away in a safe deposit box, not allowed to touch the Holocaust when you're studying history. Why? I realize that the why is because if more people actually looked at it, they would recognize the similarities of the stages, the years before the gas chambers. Now, the fact that the gas chambers happened as, a Auschwitz survivor, Primo Levi, an Italian, had said, it happened, therefore it can happen again. It can happen everywhere. That's a lesson. That's an important lesson. We are still, human beings didn't really change. And human beings of all groups are capable of being, leaders and saints and devils. We really have to understand human nature has the capacity for both, for good and for evil, and we have to make choices. And when we are confronted by evil, we need to recognize it, and do something about it rather than close our eyes and not see. That's the worst thing.
Mr. Shirav, my last question to you, and seeing that you've actually drawn the parallels now, I would like to find out from you when this pandemic started to roll out, which we actually say it's a pandemic. When was the first time you've actually started to see the similarities and say, no, to me, it seems eerily similar to what I experienced as a child and what the Jewish people has experienced. And it seems like this is exactly the same trajectory that, or the pathway that this COVID-19 is steering, not just now in Germany, but on a global scale. When did you start to actually see that similarities?
I think, well, first of all, I didn't, I looked into the idea of lockdowns and all that, and I saw that actually science said the exact opposite. Yeah. Never do that. Mm-hmm. Really, there's evidence. So I realized there's something really wrong. Then the other thing, the lockdowns, what they actually did, there were a couple of things that the lockdowns did. Yes, they made people, prisoners in their home, isolate them. Isolation is the worst thing. And of course, a lot of elderly really, really suffered. They died. But they also demolished local businesses. Well, that's the transfer of wealth. So everybody has to now use Zoom, technology, Amazon, only the big box stores, and do everything digitally. At that time, there wasn't the digital and all that, but there certainly was house arrest and things like that, where you couldn't go out and there were curfews. But once they really started to push the vaccine, and before it was even launched, before it was before it was let out of the bag, because I think it must have been already in some warehouse before, because it was talked about so much, as Gates called it, the final solution. That, and of course, that it got linked right away to a green passport. I mean, that's it. That was, yeah. That the parallel is definite. And, right now, I think it was France that took back passports of people who didn't have the third shot. Well, that's what Hitler did. I think it was 38 or 39 when he eliminated the passports of Jews, but that was the time that the gates were closed. Before 38, he actually encouraged Jews to leave. They just had to leave all their property. But many didn't go, many did.
Thank you very much for your evidence, Mr. Shirav.
Thank you.
Well, Vera, I want to say I'm sure glad that someone like you is still sitting in the saddle, because that is really, really encouraging. So we're not all alone here, but we have someone at our side who keeps reminding us of what this all comes from. And I think if we don't see history, history will repeat itself. That's why it's so important to see the parallels. And I think, I'm wondering, would you agree with that? Those who chose and choose to ignore the parallels, aren't they the true Holocaust deniers?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. But especially those who pounce on people who do make the connection. This has been, this is a constant. I mean, Bobby Kennedy had that happen to him, and in fact, I began to really take on whatever interviews I'm asked after an interview with Bobby, in which I raised it into something, and he said, well, you can talk about that, but I can't. And I thought to myself, why not? I mean, talk clarifies. Talk is how we communicate. I mean, I don't believe in having subjects verboten. If somebody forbids me, then that's what I want to go and look up. Because I finally realized that this is very important. They are doing that with the venom, and a lot of Jewish institutions are doing it, trying to prevent people from seeing the connection. Well, I'm doing that.
Mrs. Shirav,
Yes.
thank you so much. You remember me, the Albert Einstein quote, if I were to remain silent,
Yes.
I will be guilty of complicity.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, look, that is what we have to remember. Not to be complicit by silence, because silence means we don't want to see what's happening, but it's happening, and it only gets escalated.
Well, thank you again, Vera. I think this is very powerful, and I think this will, at least for many people, make a big difference. It's a difference between someone who has heard stories and someone who has been there, who has seen it. That's why it's so powerful. And I think we have to continue doing this kind of work, all of us. And that's what I hope will inspire many more people to speak out and not to be silenced, because that's what makes the difference. That is what Professor Desmond says. All of us have to keep on talking about what's really going on. We have to bring out the truth, because once we're silenced, it's all over. This will never happen. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. This was
Do
extremely
another
powerful.
round. I think you ought to do this as a traveling show, because no, really, you want to reach more and more people, because that's the point. I mean, I think that anybody who plugs in, it opens up, avenues of information, and obviously it's credible people, and that's important. there's a lot going on, really. Many are doing things, but I think this kind of format is very important, and I think it probably should do more of it.
Thank you. This will probably be only the first step. We have decided that there's going to be more to come. Again, if you're going to be with us, it's very encouraging, and I think it'll turn a lot of people around and make a lot of people decide to get off the right side of the fence of those 40%. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you. Good luck to all
Thank
of us.
you very much. To all of us, yes. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Yeah. So this is, as Vera said, this is not the end. There will be more. We'll take a short break of maybe 2 weeks or so. And during that break, we're going to play some of the witnesses' testimony, because it is always important, as Patrick said, if you're in a court of law, and especially if you have a jury, to appeal to the emotions. What we've also learned is by having the victims speak out, they connect with each other. It has a therapeutic value, which we were both surprised to see. So this is what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks, and also we're going to summarize all of the 6 sessions that we've had, so that we can see them in 20-minute clips. That will be easier to digest, and many more people will be able to see this. And since these are all real witnesses, real experts, I think it's going to be very, very persuasive. At the end of the next 2 weeks, we're going to have closing arguments, and then we're going to have people vote on what they've seen. The jury will decide whether or not the 6 people, the putative defendants, will be indicted. But until then, we will show some of the clips, and we will summarize, show some of the witnesses' testimony. We will summarize the long sessions. Some of the sessions were really long. Tonight's session was not quite as long, but it's going to be easier to digest, and I think that's going to be helpful in coming to a conclusion and coming to decisions. Also, what we want to see and what we hope is going to come from this is that many more people in their regions will understand that they have to do it themselves. No cavalry is going to come riding in. We're going to have to do this ourselves. In particular, the judiciary. We have to make the judiciary do what it's supposed to do, or set up a whole new judiciary. And that's something we're going to be talking about as well. There are some excellent ideas already. Okay. So thank you very much, everyone. Your Honor, Judge Rui de Fonseca y Castro, thank you for staying with us so long. And Deepali, thank you for staying with us so long. I know you're 4.5 hours ahead of us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Deepali. Thank you, Patrick.
May I make a shout out?
Of course, go ahead.
To the young people that are here.
Yeah.
We have there's a lot of gray hair in this group, let's face it, Well, I'll speak for myself. Vera could have more gray hair than she probably has, but she's been around, right? What we want, I'll tell you what my generation wants, is to see young people involved.
Yeah.
And I'm so encouraged by the young people that are involved here.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, this is the future. The old people, the older generation, can't fight the battles. They will not have the energy. They will not have the stamina. I mean, there's lots of reasons why, because old people eventually get old and die. But the younger generation that's getting this, that's standing up. I'm thinking of the song by Eric Clapton out of Great Britain, "Stand and Deliver."
Excellent song.
These young people are standing and delivering, and I'm so encouraged by that. I want to thank all you young people. Go out and find a friend and get them involved, whatever. But this is the encouragement of the age today, that there's a younger generation that's really, really starting to get it. And this is the hope for the future right now, in my opinion. So thank you, guys.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Wood.
So there's more to come. Thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend.
Thank you all. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.